Welcome to lesson number 5. This is part 2 of the chemical nomenclature section of the course. So in the last video, you learned about naming binary ionic compounds that contain only 2 elements, so one metal and one non-metal. Today we're going to be, in this lesson, we're going to be adding on the idea of polyatomic ions to that first base that we had. So polyatomic, poly means many or more than one. Atomic is atoms. So these are ions that contain multiple atoms. So rather than just one, like a chloride ion or a fluoride ion, we're now going to have these other types of ions that have multiple either types of elements or numbers of elements. So 1 nitrogen and 3 oxygens, or a chlorine and 3 oxygens, or so on and so forth. So the difference here with these types is that when we name them, we don't change anything about the name of the ion. So in the last video, we were looking at changing the name of the atom to the ion name. So from chlorine to fluoride, or from chlorine to chloride, not fluoride. So chloride was the name of the ion. These are already names of ions, so we don't change the ending at all. This list of polyatomic ions, if we were in regular school, you would have access to on your exam or any other time. You don't have to memorize them. On your periodic table, if you were able to print double-sided, you would find the list of polyatomic ions on the back of the page. For me, my current printer doesn't print double-sided, so it's on a separate piece of paper, but you have the list of polyatomic ions there. So keep your periodic table handy for when you're doing these practice questions. So the formula that we go by for naming these compounds is we still put the metal first, and the name of the metal remains the same. And then we give the polyatomic ion name, and we don't change it in any way. So first example, name CaOH2. This is Ca is calcium. And then OH, looking at our list of polyatomic ions, OH is there. It's called hydroxide. So this would be calcium hydroxide. And that's it. Example number 2, we have aluminum, that's our metal, and then NO3. NO3, looking at the list here, there it is, NO3. It's called nitrate. So we would call this aluminum nitrate. So name of the metal unchanged, name of the polyatomic ion unchanged. Things get a little bit more complicated when we look at writing the formula for compounds containing polyatomic ions, just because when you have multiple types of elements in an ion, we have to make sure that when we crisscross, we note the number of the whole polyatomic ion is increasing, not just one piece. So you'll notice in both of these examples, the polyatomic ion was in brackets, and the subscript was written outside of the bracket. That's to tell you that there are 2 of the whole polyatomic ion, so 2 hydrogens and 2 oxygens. If you were to write it as CaOH2 like that, without brackets, that would tell you that you had 1 calcium, 1 oxygen, and 2 hydrogens. But we need 2 of the whole polyatomic ion. Think about it as a unit, and you can't really divide the polyatomic ion up. So not like that. Let's do a couple practice ones. Magnesium phosphate. We're going to go through the same steps for the crisscross method as we did before. So we'll start by writing out the ions. So Mg, magnesium, has a charge of 2+. Phosphate, we can look up in our list, okay? Find the word phosphate, and that will tell you what it is. So it's PO4, and the charge on it is 3-. So PO4, 3-. Now we crisscross the numbers down. and write it out with the correct subscript. So the 3 from the phosphate comes down to the magnesium, so Mg3. The 2 comes down to apply to the whole phosphate group. So we need to put phosphate, PO4, in brackets and put a 2 there. Okay, if you leave out the brackets, it looks like there's 42 oxygens, which is definitely not what we want. So brackets around polyatomic ions, but only if there's more than one. So if this was a single thing, if we had something like lithium phosphate, let's say, PO43 minus. Just as a side note here. Lithium has a charge of 1+, so when you crisscross down, you would get Li3PO4. And we wouldn't put brackets and a 1, so we don't write the 1 or the brackets if it's not needed. Only if you have a number other than a 1 coming down there. So we'll see that in this example, lithium sulfate. Lithium is a charge of 1+, like we just said. Sulfate, look for it in the list. There it is. Follow it over. It's SO4 2-. So SO4 2-. We crisscross, lose the symbols, keep the numbers. So Li2 SO4. Okay, so remember the number, if it's a subscript, has to go outside the brackets, and we write the brackets only if that's a number other than 1. If it's a 1, we just leave it the way it is. So looking at some practice, keep your list of polyatomic ions and your periodic table handy. Complete the practice questions on pages 13 and 14. I've posted answers to all of the practice in question number 1 and number 2. So you can try those out and then check your answers. So do a little self-marking to see how it went. Then give question number 3, and then there's some more practice for giving the names on page 14 on the next page. So questions 3 and 4 are to be submitted for review, so for completion marks and for me to give you some feedback if you need it. So pictures of those 2 pages submitted